So this is an extra video for the day, guys. This is a pair of Hub's Whitesides. This is not something you will see very often. There's very, very few left. These birds originated from an old breeder in Riverside, New Jersey by the name of Charlie Hubs. And Charlie started with pigeons in 1927. They're in Riverside, New Jersey. Charlie lived in the same house he was born in. He was born in 1920. And he got his first pigeons in 1927, and the first purebred, and the story he told was that the first pigeons he got from his aunt. They were common pigeons. They were basically just given to him by his aunt when they were squabs, and he raised them by hand when he was a young child. And he got his first purebred pigeons in 1928 from a guy by the name of Mr. Alfred. And Mr. Alfred, as he was known, was a tippler flyer. And Charlie flew tipplers for about a year. And then in 1929, thereabouts, he was over at Mr. Alfred's house with his father, and he met a rover breeder by the name of Les Mons. And Les Mons was moving to Riverside, New Jersey at the time, and was a friend of Mr. Alfred's. And he met Charlie for the first time. And even though he was a very, very young child at the time, must have liked the kid. And because Les Mons was moving to Riverside, New Jersey, he trusted Charlie to take care of some of his birds for him. And the rest is kind of history. That Les Mons became Charlie's mentor at that time. And Les Mons was an interesting guy. He was a very well-known rover breeder in New Jersey at that time. There's articles from 1930 about Les Mons, who at that time was still a younger fellow. Les Mons was born in 1903, so he was in his 20s. They're in the late 20s. Going on to 30, had a young family. He was a carpenter by trade. And had done fairly well for himself, so Les Mons could afford to pretty much buy whatever pigeons he wanted. And the stories go that Les Mons and his acolyte, or his close friend, Frank Sinclair, who was also known as Frank Sinclairus, they used to drive all over the place in the Northeast, around New Jersey, up to New York, Connecticut, Vermont, all over the place looking for rovers. And because Les Mons was a fairly successful carpenter, he had enough resources to build really nice lofts, and he could afford to buy pigeons and travel a lot. And he did quite a bit of buying. In 1935, him and Frank Sinclair, they bought out the loft of Arthur Karp of Cleveland, Ohio. And that's where these birds basically originate, is in 1936, 1 year after Les Mons and Frank Sinclair bought out Arthur Karp. Les Mons gave Charlie his first Arthur Karp blooded pigeon, which was a red-spangled cock. The story Charlie told was that the only reason he got it from Les Mons was the bird developed canker. And Les Mons was kind of a hard ass. I mentioned him in the adenovirus video and some other things talking about diseases. That Les Mons was the sort of person, he would not tolerate a sick pigeon in his loft. If there was a bird that was sick, he thought there was something wrong with it. And he wound up giving Charlie, who was still pretty young at that time, 15, 16 years old, this cockbird, and said, if you can cure that bird, you can keep it. And Charlie treated the bird with Aneptin, which at that time was a pretty common canker treatment. And Charlie cured the bird, and he took it back to Les Mans and said, here's your cured bird back. And Les Mans told Charlie, no, you keep that pigeon. And that pigeon actually became the foundation of Charlie's bloodline. And that's what all these pigeons here go back to. And Charlie never married. For whatever reason, he chose not to marry. He lived his days out in his parents' house, inherited the house. During World War II, Charlie had already become well enough known as a young pigeon flyer in New Jersey that he was headhunted in the first few years of World War II by the U.S. Signal Corps to be a pigeon signal commander. That basically that's what Charlie did during the war. His rank was he was a Tech 5 when he retired after the war. And a Tech apparently means, in that military jargon in the Signal Corps, that it's a non-combat trained specialty position. And Charlie's specialty was flying and feeding pigeons. And needless to say, he was specifically headhunted to run a mobile loft during World War II. And he actually wound up wounded. He had a Purple Heart that he was awarded after the war. So a really interesting guy. And as he got older, he was, kind of always a backyard flyer. Really well known, but, he didn't compete or anything. He didn't show pigeons or anything. He just kind of did it for himself. And he spent many, many years working on this bloodline. Like I said, starting basically around 1936 until his death. And Charlie lived to see 87 years old. He died in 2007. And I was lucky enough, before Charlie died, to get a handful of pigeons from him around about 2004, 2005. Some of the last of his line. By that time, he had stopped flying his pigeons. The hawks had become really bad, and he was, very fearful of flying them by that time because he was losing quite a few. And then subsequently, Charlie died in 2007. You can go online, and there's a few articles about Charlie out there about how he developed his bloodline and what his thoughts were on flying them and his background. And then a couple of years later, after that, 5 or 6 years, and by that time I think Charlie had been gone for a few years. I was able to also get some help from Ralph Crespo at RC Lofts, who many of you probably follow on YouTube. One of his friends had managed to have a couple of Hubs-blooded birds, and I was able to get those with the help of Ralph from him. So I was able to supplement the small handful I had obtained from Charlie. And needless to say, I've maintained them the whole time. And they're quite unique. They're considered rollers, but if you look at them, the body type is very, very different from what you ordinarily see out of a Birmingham roller. Much longer cast, much longer wing, broader feather, kind of a looser feather, and they've got a lot more fly in them than roll. Arthur Karp, who was the original source of the birds, was primarily known as an endurance flyer, and subsequently there in Cleveland, where Karp was from, and we'll talk about him shortly, because that's kind of an interesting story too. A lot of people who wound up with Karp-blooded birds around Cleveland in later years, they referred to them as endurance rollers. They bred them for basically high and long flight, and to some degree for short homing ability. that these birds will home on the average bird 10 to 50 miles. They've just been bred very, very different from, what we think of as rovers. And in Cleveland, they used to actually race them for short distances. The old Cleveland Rover Club. I've actually got some records of the Cleveland Rover Club before it went defunct, which includes a lot of their endurance scorecards and things of that nature, and race scorecards. And I've got some taped interviews with some of the members there and stuff like that, and kind of a really interesting microcosm in the rover sport, because we have these perceptions of what a rover is, and these birds were very, very different from them. They have followed a very different evolution in the hands of breeders. Being bred more for the idea of endurance and high flying than actually rolling. So basically we're talking about birds that will fly 6 to 14 hours and maybe roll occasionally. So kind of a very interesting pigeon. And not very, very many of them left. Like I said, most of them went back to a breeder by the name of Arthur Karp, and it's not that he originated it, but he was apparently the common source of most of the birds, including not only Charlie's, but also what they referred to as endurance rovers in Cleveland. And Arthur Karp was an interesting guy. When he sold out to Mans and Sinclair, or Sinclairus, as he was also known, because Frank Sinclair, he's from a Polish immigrant family, and as was kind of common in those days, a lot of immigrants, modified their names a bit to become American. And Frank Sinclair's family was one of those. His family was Sinclairus, but they changed it to Sinclair because they wanted to be seen as Americans, obviously, and not just as immigrants. So Les Mans in Sinclair bought out Arthur Karp. And Arthur Karp was fairly well known there in Cleveland. He was considered one of the grand old men of rovers at that time around Cleveland. And there's always been a lot of myth around Arthur Karp. That there's some old articles out there on various rover sites that he wrote 1920s, 1930s. And most people's perception is that he was an old guy. And as some of you know, some of the work I do is I'm basically a mining historian, and that's one of the things I do in the mining industry is I do a lot of research, and history of any type really turns my crank, so I'm always interested in, digging up stuff and trying to get to the bottom of things like that, and where things come from and how they got here. And Arthur Karp was kind of a tough nut to crack, because I kept looking for an old guy in Cleveland named Arthur C. Karp. And it was kind of tough. And what I eventually found out was that the common perception of Arthur Karp was totally wrong. He was not an old guy. There were some stories that he had been around going back into the 1880s, and it actually turns out he was pretty close to the same age as Les Mans and Frank Sinclair. He was born at the turn of the century. And he was a younger guy, so needless to say, when he was writing these articles, people perceived him as an old-timer because he knew a lot. But he was actually just a really, really heavily studied young guy who happened to know a lot of old-timers and was very switched on to the goings-on and the rover flying and high flyer sport there around Cleveland. And one of the things I had a lot of trouble with was, trying to track his background and, what happened to him, because I assume that, when most people sell out, they do so for old age purposes. And what I actually found out was that Arthur Karp, he was in his 30s when he sold out, and there was quite a bit of correspondence between him and Frank Sinclair that was left intact. A lot of it very degraded, half-rotten pages, faded, mice chewed, stuff like that, you know, kind of very hard to decipher. And I spent a lot of time going through, you know, what documents like that I had access to, and kind of digging into Arthur Karp, and kind of a very interesting, mysterious guy. And I later found out that, you know, he was a young guy, and I found out that not long after he sold the birds off to Les Mans and Frank Sinclair and got out of them, I always assumed, him being an old guy, he must have died or something. But I couldn't find any burial records or anything like that. And kind of as I kept digging, I finally found him, and it turns out that the guy just had a lot of issues with probably some sort of mental illness issues. He drank a lot, and I found out that a couple years after selling out to Les Mans and Frank Sinclair, the poor guy actually hung himself in his parents' basement. And the house is still there in Cleveland. And it took a lot of cross-checking to figure it out. So it kind of solved a big mystery behind these pigeons. But at the time when he sold the Mans and Sinclair, he supposedly sold the last of the birds to him. But then in the correspondence, you would see he would always come up with another pair of pigeons. And there seemed to be kind of some of these questions about where some of them came from, if they were really the same bloodline or not. So so there's kind of a lot of questions as far as where the Karp birds came from. But they did all come from Cleveland there, and that's kind of the basis of all of them. So kind of a very, very interesting story, quite tragic. I was actually even hoping to maybe talk to some of Arthur Karp's descendants, and I ended up finally, and I kind of kept noticing this pattern that he had quite a few relatives die at young ages, and I kind of always suspected that maybe they went the same way Arthur Karp did, that maybe they, committed suicide or had some sort of other mental health issues that, resulted in kind of an early demise. And I later did some digging, and I actually found a great-grandson of one of Arthur Karp's sisters that I was hoping to maybe get some answers from, and the guy was a mental health expert, and he was into genealogy, and I thought, wow, this is going to be the guy who has all the answers I could ever want about Arthur Karp. And I wound up finding out that after I tried to contact him, I heard from one of the guy's relatives. I heard from his wife, and that guy too, believe it or not, almost 80 years to the day that Arthur Karp hung himself, that relative committed suicide because he too had some sort of issue. So it's kind of a very strange, peculiar, very tragic story behind these pigeons before Charlie got them. That just kind of very, very strange. A very strange story. But chances are you probably will not see any more of these pigeons elsewhere. Like I said, I got my first ones from Charlie almost 20 years ago now, and I've kept them and keep flying them. And they fly quite a bit different than other rovers. They will fly their asses off. Whatever you want them to do, they will do. If you want them to fly at night, they will fly at night. If you want them to fly 10 hours, they'll fly 10 hours. And they will fly as high as you want them to fly. They will go out of sight in a matter of a short period, and they will stay there. And they're a little more hawk-proof than the normal rollers I have, like my creams and my plonas and stuff like that, and my pencils, and various other lines of rovers that are, just pretty much bred just to roll. But these guys, they kit really strongly, and as I said, they will fly their asses off. They are unbelievable flyers. They have super high endurance. And obviously the reason is, back in those days, You know, in Cleveland in those days, they did do an awful lot of crossing with rovers and used, you know, various European high flyers and endurance flying breeds and crossed into them. So they're very, very different. A lot of people see them and they mistake them for Dutch high flyers, because they do kind of look that way. You know, especially with the white-sided marking, which Charvey worked on for a long time. When he started out, they actually didn't have any white-side markings like this at all. They were mostly badges and white flights and white tails and stuff like that. And Charvey bred them completely different. He decided he really liked the white-side marking, which he produced by chance, and he intentionally selected for it for many, many years. 60 or 70 years he worked on them. So kind of some very, very unique pigeons, very, very, very rare. Not too many around. Most people have never heard of them. They don't know about them. They don't know much about Charvey. But, and in my opinion, some of the most beautiful pigeons in the world as far as their colors. You know, I mean, just a lovely dark recessive red with the white shield markings. You know, these two are actually, you know, fairly well marked for the family. Some of them are more of a rose wing, mottled wing, but very, very different than anything out there. But I just kind of wanted to share, since this is something that's not really seen anymore. Charlie actually sent pigeons to all 50 states in the Union, and there's really very few left that I know of. I know that I've probably got the largest stud left, and I know that Bob Prisco, who was you know, is really well known in racing circles, especially in Taiwan, where Bob has sent a lot of racing pigeons. Bob actually grew up around Charlie, and he was kind of his agent, and kind of helped Charlie do his best to spread his pigeons. So Bob was responsible for shipping most of them. When I got my first ones through Charlie, he had Bob ship them, and Bob still has a few, you know, just to maintain them. And even he said that, you know, I've probably got the largest stud left anywhere. Only other large stud I know of, there's apparently a couple that went to Hungary. And there's still some being bred over there by one or two breeders that are trying to keep them maintained over there. But I keep about 10 pair, and it's probably the majority of what's left of the bloodline, you know, and I will keep them as long as I can, you know, keep them going. This is, like I said, it's a very, very old bloodline. I mean, Charlie was working, you know, between my work and Charlie's work and all that, and Les Mann's back there and Arthur Karp, we're talking about, you know, about 120 years worth of breeding behind them, just that we know of for sure. But needless to say, just wanted to do another video and share something, you know, as I've done in the past, things you don't see very often. So these are Hub's Whitesides. See you next time.